there is a silent poison that we have been taught to drink daily. The profound belief that every provocation requires an immediate response, that every fire demands our presence, and that the speed of our reaction is the ultimate measure of our strength. But what if your rushing is the exact chain that makes you a slave? There is an exhausting, pathetic cycle in the modern human experience, and you know the exact heavy sensation deep in your bones. You live in a perpetual state of putting out psychological fires. You lose hours of sleep lying in the dark, your heart racing, drafting the perfect, devastating response to a passive-aggressive email or a subtle insult. You feel the sickening, dizzying sensation that you are constantly dancing to a frantic, chaotic rhythm dictated by people who do not even care about your peace. You feel like an emotional puppet, jerking wildly every time a toxic person decides to pull a string. Listen to me very carefully. This endless exhaustion is not happening because you are inherently weak, and it is not happening because you lack intelligence. It is a matter of pure neurobiology. Psychological predators and toxic individuals deliberately inject a false sense of urgency into your environment. They do this to intentionally hijack your amygdala, the primitive fight-or-flight center of your brain, effectively shutting down your prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic and sovereign control. They force you to act on pure, unfiltered survival instinct because they know that when you rush, you make mistakes. They know that speed is the enemy of strategy. Today, we are going to freeze that clock. I am going to reveal the 4 phases of weaponized patience, grounded in the ancient, lethal wisdom of the Stoic philosopher Seneca and the martial art of profound stillness. We will forge a mind that cannot be rushed. But listen with absolute, unbroken attention. The 4th phase is the ultimate frontier. It is the crucible where 99% of people fail miserably because it demands the violent sacrifice of the loudest, most fragile part of your own ego. If you are truly ready to stop reacting like a hunted prey and assume the terrifying, silent posture of the apex predator, walk with me now. Settle your breathing. Ground your physical weight into the floor beneath you. Drop your shoulders and release the tension in your jaw. To master the weapon of time, we must first deeply understand how time is currently being used against you. This brings us to the 1st phase of weaponized patience, dismantling the illusion of urgency and shattering the predator's fake clock. 2,000 years ago, the great Stoic philosopher and statesman Seneca observed the frantic emotional chaos of the Roman Empire and wrote a principle that remains one of the most devastating psychological weapons ever forged. He said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Seneca understood a fundamental truth about human nature and emotional warfare. Anger, panic, and outrage have an incredibly short half-life. They are chemical fires that burn with terrifying heat, but they run out of fuel extremely quickly if they are not constantly fed with new reactions. Toxic people, manipulators, and emotional predators are instinctively aware of this chemical reality. They know that if they give you time to think, you will see through their manipulation. You will recognize their inconsistencies. You will realize that their power over you is entirely an illusion. Therefore, their primary tactic is to manufacture an environment of absolute, suffocating urgency. Observe how a toxic person operates. They never approach you with calm, measured logic. They send explosive, emotionally charged messages. They make sudden, dramatic accusations out of nowhere. They create artificial crises, presenting minor inconveniences as catastrophic emergencies that require your immediate, undivided attention. They use aggressive tones, fast pacing, and absolute statements. They build a psychological pressure cooker, and they throw you inside it. When you are trapped in this pressure cooker, your biological programming screams at you to resolve the tension immediately. You feel a burning compulsion to reply within 5 seconds. You feel the desperate need to defend your character, to clarify the misunderstanding, or to pacify their sudden rage. But the moment your fingers start typing that frantic response, the moment you raise your voice to match their chaotic energy, the trap snaps shut. You have surrendered your sovereignty. You have stepped onto their battlefield, playing by their rules, operating on their accelerated timeline. You are no longer a sovereign master, you are merely a reacting organism. To weaponize your patience, you must completely shatter this false clock. You must realize that in 99% of modern human interactions, there is absolutely no literal emergency. No one is bleeding. The building is not on fire. The urgency is a complete psychological fabrication designed exclusively to bypass your rational defenses. When the explosive message arrives, when the passive-aggressive insult is dropped in the middle of a meeting, or when the dramatic accusation is hurled at you, you must cultivate the supreme discipline of the heavy pause. You read the words, you hear the sound waves, you feel the spike of adrenaline hitting your bloodstream, urging you to strike back. And in that precise, critical moment, you violently apply the brakes. You do absolutely nothing. You look at the glowing screen, or you look directly into the eyes of the person trying to provoke you, and you drop a massive, unmovable wall of silence between their chaos and your peace. You decide, with cold, calculated sovereignty, that you will not respond for 24 hours. Or perhaps you decide you will not respond at all. This delay is not an act of cowardice. It is not avoidance. It is a highly active, lethal psychological maneuver. By refusing to engage on their timeline, you are instantly reclaiming the remote control of your nervous system. You are starving the chemical fire of its oxygen. In neuroscience, this pause allows the amygdala to naturally deregulate. The cortisol flushes out of your bloodstream. The prefrontal cortex comes back online, restoring your access to high-level logic, strategic thinking, and emotional detachment. But more importantly, consider the devastating psychological impact this delay has on the predator. Manipulators feed on the immediate gratification of your reaction. When they drop a bomb, they expect an explosion. When they pull the string, they expect the puppet to dance. When you introduce a heavy, crushing delay, you plunge them into a state of agonizing uncertainty. They stare at their phone, waiting for your angry paragraph, but it never comes. The hours tick by. The silence grows heavier. Their manufactured urgency dissolves into thin air, leaving them completely alone with their own toxic energy. The delay strips them of their power. It forces them to realize that they cannot dictate your internal weather. They cannot force your hand. They are screaming into a void, and the void is not screaming back. In the Shaolin tradition, we observe the predator in the wild. A tiger does not rush its strike. It does not run frantically at the first sign of movement. It lowers its center of gravity. It blends into the tall grass. It watches. It waits for the absolute perfect fraction of a second when the prey is entirely off balance, and only then does it unleash its power. The tiger's patience is not a lack of action. It is the accumulation of lethal potential. The weapon of patience begins with this fundamental realization. Your reaction is a privilege, and you must make the world wait for it. By freezing the clock, you transform from a reactive victim into an unshakable fortress. You let the arrows of their urgency strike the stone walls of your delay and shatter into dust. But creating the pause is only the beginning of the war. Once you have stopped their false clock, you must learn how to actively use the silence to drain their vitality. You must understand the mechanics of psychological starvation. There is a devastating misconception about patience that society has deeply ingrained in your psychology. You have been taught that patience is merely the act of suffering quietly. You believe it is a passive, submissive virtue, the act of sitting with your hands folded in your lap, tolerating disrespect, and hoping that the storm will eventually pass. In the realm of the untouchable mind, this definition is completely false. Sovereign patience is never passive. It is a highly active, calculating, and lethal form of psychological observation. It is the deliberate, strategic withdrawal of your vital energy to force the enemy into a state of total starvation. To wield this weapon effectively, we must dissect the neurochemistry of a toxic human being. Why does the manipulator provoke you? Why do they send the venomous text message, whisper the calculated lie, or orchestrate the dramatic public confrontation? They do not do this simply because they are angry. They do it because their brain is fundamentally addicted to the dopamine release of power. And in the twisted psychology of an emotional predator, Power is measured entirely by their ability to alter your internal state. Your frustration is their feast. Your tears are their validation. The long, frantic, over-explained paragraphs you send in defense of your character are the absolute finest delicacies to their ravenous ego. Every time you lose your temper, every time you desperately try to correct their false narrative, you are hand-delivering a massive dose of dopamine directly into their bloodstream. You are proving to them, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they exist, that they matter, and that they possess the gravity to pull you out of your own orbit. Weaponized patience is the iron vault that cuts off their food supply. When you apply this strategy, you do not just delay your response. You actively observe their desperate attempts to feed, and you deny them every single calorie of your kinetic energy. Imagine a wild feral animal that has just been captured and placed inside a cage made of incredibly thick, unbreakable, soundproof glass. The animal is furious. It throws its physical weight against the transparent walls. It bares its teeth. It claws frantically at the corners, and it roars with a terrifying, chaotic violence. Now, imagine you are standing completely safe on the other side of that glass. If you walk up to the cage, tap on the glass, yell back at the animal, or wave your hands in distress, the animal's frenzy will instantly multiply. Your reaction validates its aggression. You have engaged in the dance. But what happens if you simply stand there, perfectly still, with your hands resting behind your back? What happens if you look at the animal with a cold, detached, almost clinical curiosity? The animal will continue to thrash against the glass for a time. It will escalate its violence, trying desperately to force you to react. But because the glass is soundproof, and because you are entirely unmovable, the animal is expending massive amounts of its own physical energy while you expend absolutely none. You are not fighting the beast. You are simply allowing the beast to fight the impenetrable barrier of your silence. Eventually, biology dictates the outcome. The animal will burn through its adrenaline, its muscles will ache with lactic acid, its lungs will burn for oxygen, and it will inevitably collapse on the floor of the cage, utterly exhausted and defeated by its own frantic exertion. This is the exact, brutal physics of psychological starvation. When you withhold your reaction from a toxic person, they will almost always escalate their behavior initially. This is called an extinction burst. Because the tactic that usually gets them their dopamine, provoking you, is suddenly not working. Their unmastered brain panics. They will send a second, nastier text message. They will launch a smear campaign behind your back. They will throw a louder, more theatrical tantrum. They will throw themselves violently against the glass of your boundaries. In the past, this escalation would terrify you. It would force you to break your silence and rush in to manage their emotions, desperately trying to calm the animal down. But now, you possess the mind of the emperor. You understand that their escalation is not a sign of their power. It is the ultimate proof of their desperate starvation. You stand outside the glass. You apply the stillness of the Shaolin master. In the martial arts, we know that if an opponent throws a wild, heavy punch, the most devastating counterattack is often not a block, but a void. You step slightly out of range and allow the sheer kinetic energy of their own missed strike to pull them off balance, hyperextending their joints and driving them into the ground. Their own aggression becomes the instrument of their destruction. When the emotional predator escalates, you step into the void. You watch them type paragraph after paragraph of accusations. You watch them try to bait you with guilt, and you offer them nothing but the heavy, suffocating weight of your absolute silence. You let them punch the air. The psychological pain they experience in this void is excruciating. Without your reaction to serve as a mirror, they are forced to look at their own reflection. They are left holding the full, heavy burden of their own toxicity. They realize with a sickening drop in their stomach that their chaos has no landing gear. It cannot dock in your harbor. They are burning thousands of calories of emotional energy trying to manipulate a statue, while you are simply observing the weather pass by, conserving all of your vital force for the construction of your own empire. You watch their ego slowly starve to death. You watch the extinction burst reach its peak, and then, inevitably, you watch them collapse into a pathetic, confused exhaustion. They will retreat, not because you fought them and won, but because you simply refuse to feed them. You have conquered the enemy without drawing a single drop of your own blood. You have stopped their clock. You have starved their dopamine circuit. You have forced the feral animal to exhaust itself against the impenetrable glass of your sovereign silence. But the war of attrition has one final, devastating phase before the victory is complete. Toxic people do not just rely on explosive rage. They rely on complex, deeply woven webs of lies and manipulation to maintain their false reality. To utterly destroy these webs without lifting a finger, you must learn to harness the thermodynamic properties of time itself. There is a brilliant, unforgiving law of physics that applies directly to human psychology. It is the law of energy conservation. In the natural universe, the truth is the baseline state of reality. The truth simply exists. Because it is aligned with the actual physical events that occurred in space and time, the truth requires absolutely zero caloric or mental energy to maintain. A mountain does not need to exert energy to remember that it is a mountain. It just stands there, massive and effortless. A lie, however, is a completely different architectural structure. A manipulation, a false narrative, or a projected mask of fake virtue is an artificial construct that defies the gravity of reality. Therefore, it requires a massive, continuous expenditure of vital energy to keep it suspended in the air. Let us deconstruct the neuroscience of deception. When a toxic person weaves a false narrative, when they launch a smear campaign behind your back, playing the innocent victim while painting you as the villain, their brain is forced to work at maximum capacity. The prefrontal cortex must constantly monitor the lie. They have to remember exactly what they said, who they said it to, and what specific details they fabricated. They must consciously suppress their true, toxic nature in front of their new audience. They are juggling a dozen fragile glass balls in the air, terrified that if they drop even one, the entire illusion of their character will shatter into a million pieces. When you become the target of this deception, your unmastered ego screams in absolute agony. The injustice of being lied about burns your blood. Your primitive instincts demand that you immediately run out into the public square, gather your evidence, and scream the truth from the rooftops. You want to expose them. You want to meticulously tear down their arguments and prove to the world that they are a fraud. You feel a burning, desperate urgency to clear your name. Listen to the brutal, surgical truth of this dynamic. The moment you attempt to expose the manipulator, you are stepping directly into their maze. You are burning your own precious, sovereign energy, trying to dismantle a structure that is already destined to collapse under its own weight. When you argue with their lies, you accidentally give their lies validity. You show the audience that there is a debate to be had. You descend into the mud to wrestle with a pig, and you realize too late that the pig absolutely loves the mud, while you simply become exhausted and filthy. Weaponized patience dictates a completely different, vastly superior strategy. You do not fight the lie. You allow time to fight it for you. Time is the ultimate solvent of all deception. Time is a heavy, relentless, unstoppable force that tests the structural integrity of every human mask. Because the manipulator's false narrative requires so much caloric and psychological energy to maintain, they are operating on a ticking biological clock. They will inevitably experience cognitive fatigue. In the philosophy of the Shaolin Temple, we study the eternal conflict between water and fire. Fire is loud, dramatic, and terrifying. It consumes everything in its immediate path, producing massive amounts of heat and blinding light. A manipulator's smear campaign is a fire, but fire possesses a fatal flaw. It rapidly consumes its own fuel. If it is not constantly fed, it chokes on its own ash and dies. Water, on the other hand, is the physical embodiment of patience. Water does not scream. It does not rush unless gravity demands it. It is entirely formless, quiet, and persistent. Yet, over the span of time, The gentle, patient flow of a river will carve through the most formidable, solid granite mountain on Earth. The water does not argue with the rock, it simply outlasts it. You must become the water. When the toxic person builds a massive bonfire of lies about your character, you do not try to blow the fire out. You do not throw yourself into the flames. You step far away from the heat. You conserve your vital force, and you sit in absolute, sovereign stillness. You weaponize your patience by watching the clock. What happens when you simply wait? The physics of exhaustion take over. The manipulator, starved of your reaction and exhausted by the massive cognitive load of holding up their heavy mask, begins to make mistakes. They forget the specific details of the story they told last week. They contradict themselves in public. Because they cannot sustain the artificial performance of the good person forever, their true, venomous nature begins to leak out in moments of frustration. The people around them, the very audience they tried to turn against you, slowly begin to notice the inconsistencies. They see the cracks in the porcelain mask. You do not have to assassinate the character of a toxic person. If you give them enough time and enough silence, they will commit character suicide. They will trip over the tangled wires of their own illusions and hang themselves with their own narrative. And where are you when this inevitable collapse occurs? You are sitting on the throne of your own peace. You are entirely unbothered. Your hands are completely clean, and your energy reserves are entirely full. You have allowed the thermodynamic exhaustion of the universe to fight your battle for you. You have witnessed the profound, undeniable truth that authenticity requires no defense, and deception contains the seeds of its own destruction. The truth does not need a lawyer. It only needs an audience with enough time to watch the lie expire. You have shattered their false clock. You have starved their dopamine circuit, forcing the feral animal of their ego to exhaust itself against the impenetrable, soundproof glass of your boundaries. You have wielded the thermodynamic weight of time to slowly, ruthlessly crush their false narratives. You have built a strategic, impenetrable fortress of patience. But there is a final, terrifying frontier. You can understand these strategies intellectually. You can see the clear logic of starving the enemy. But you will still fail if you cannot conquer the deepest, darkest addiction inside your own mind. We must now walk into the ultimate execution chamber. This brings us to the fourth and final phase of weaponized patience, the silent graveyard where 99% of people break their discipline and surrender their crown. If you do not master this final boundary, the ghost of the manipulator will haunt your nervous system forever. We must execute the pathological right to the last word. The human ego is a brilliant but incredibly fragile architect. It can withstand the initial assault of a toxic person. It can hold the heavy silence for days. But there is a microscopic, highly venomous seed buried deep within your psychology. It is the desperate, burning hunger for closure. It is the absolute addiction to being right. Imagine you are at the end of a conflict. You have used your patience perfectly. The toxic person is retreating. Their manipulation has failed. But as they walk away, they throw one final pathetic insult over their shoulder. They distort reality one last time to protect their fragile pride. They send that final parting text message that is so entirely unjust, so factually incorrect, and so deeply manipulative that your blood begins to boil all over again. This is the exact threshold where 99% of humanity fails. They have held the line for weeks, but the temptation of the last word is simply too strong. The unmastered mind convinces itself that it just needs to correct this one point. It says that it cannot let them get away with saying that. It convinces you that you just need to send one final paragraph to meticulously prove to them exactly how wrong they are, and then you will block them, and then you will be free. Listen to the cold, brutal truth. The moment you hit send, the moment you open your mouth to deliver that final, devastating argument, you have lost the war. You have resurrected the parasite. You have just reached into your own chest, pulled out a massive reserve of your vital life force, and handed it directly to a starving predator. Why do we do this? We do this because we suffer from a neurobiological fantasy. We crave resolution. We have a deeply ingrained hallucination that if we just arrange the English language in the exact perfect sequence of logic and emotion, the narcissist, the manipulator, or the toxic predator will suddenly experience a profound moral epiphany. We imagine they will read our brilliant final message, fall to their knees, weep with regret, and finally validate our pain. We want them to confess their defeat. This is a complete cognitive illusion. A toxic mind does not process data, it processes power. Your brilliant, perfectly logical final argument is not read by them as the truth. It is read as a surrender of your emotional state. It proves to them that you still care. It proves that they still own valuable real estate inside your head. It proves that their final pathetic bait worked perfectly. 2,000 years ago, Seneca wrote that trying to win an argument with a fool is a deliberate choice to abandon your own sanity. In the martial arts of the mind, you must learn the devastating art of leaving the battlefield while the enemy is still shadowboxing. Weaponized patience requires a literal blood sacrifice from your ego. To become truly untouchable, you must be completely, unapologetically willing to let the toxic person believe they won the argument. You must let them walk away with their false narrative perfectly intact. You must allow them to tell their friends that they put you in your place. You must learn to sit in the intense, burning psychological discomfort of an unresolved injustice, and you must refuse to correct the record. True, terrifying invincibility is not crushing your enemy in a brilliant debate. True invincibility is looking directly at the enemy, realizing their opinion has absolutely zero currency in your sovereign empire, and turning your back on them mid-sentence. You do not walk away out of anger. You remove your attention out of absolute cold indifference. Imagine a majestic, heavy stone mountain. A frantic, angry bird flies up to the peak of the mountain and begins chirping furiously, insulting the rock, demanding that the rock move out of its way. Does the mountain rumble and roar to prove its dominance to the bird? Does the mountain desperately try to have the last word? No. The mountain simply exists. Its monumental silence is the absolute proof of its authority. The bird eventually tires its wings, loses its breath, and flies away into insignificance, while the mountain remains entirely unchanged. You must become the mountain. When you kill the desperate need to educate, fix, or verbally destroy the people who hurt you, you achieve a level of psychological freedom that the vast majority of humanity will never comprehend. You stop viewing silence as a lack of words, and you start wielding it as a heavy, impenetrable shield. You stop fighting for the last word because you finally realize that the ultimate power is not speaking last. The ultimate power is realizing the conversation was never worth having in the first place. You simply reclaim your time, your energy, and your absolute peace, leaving the predator to starve in the cold void of your absence. I know the deep, secret wound of having to bite your tongue when you know you hold the absolute truth. I know the heavy, agonizing burden of gathering your words, locking them deep inside your chest, and walking away in silence while the other side arrogantly celebrates a completely fake victory. You have been taught by the world that walking away in silence is a sign of weakness, a failure to defend your honor. But the exact opposite is true. This immense, painful restraint, this ability to swallow your pride to protect your peace, is the precise psychological armor that separates the sovereign emperors from the reactive pawns. You now possess the lethal weapon of time. You understand the architecture of the false clock, the science of psychological starvation, and the absolute power of the thermodynamic void. The heavy iron shears have been placed directly into your hands. Tomorrow, when the sun rises and the predator attempts to force you back into their chaotic, frantic rhythm, what will you do? Will you rush back into the burning building to beg a parasite for the last word? Or will you sit heavily on the throne of your own patience, pull back your energy, and simply watch them burn in their own frantic exhaustion? The choice is yours. The path is open. Ami tuofo.